Hello, I'm Claire Poole and welcome to the Climate of Sport podcast, the show in which you get the inside track on all things sport and sustainability globally. Join me every week where I'll be chatting to a special guest about news, opinion and insights on how sport is moving to a more environmentally friendly future or taking action on climate change. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Climate of Sport podcast. I'm Claire Poole, and today I'm joined by Dr. Sheila Nguyen. Sheila, welcome.
That's very, very good, Claire. You got very close. I give you 8 out of 10 for the pronunciation of my last name.
You're so kind to me. You're so kind to me.
You've got at least a minimum HD.
Right. Dr. Sheila, welcome to the podcast, one of my favourite people, and it's such a pleasure to have you here. So rather than me reading out your long and very esteemed bio in terms of your background in this space, although I will mention a few of your accolades if you don't mention them yourself, for those who don't know you yet, tell me a bit about you, your background, and how you got to being part of Sport Environment Alliance.
Right. Well, first of all, thank you, Claire, for having me and leading with favorite person, because the feelings are mutual. And just for some people in the audience to know that Claire inspired me, especially in the early days. I fangirled her for many a years, if that is that a phrase. I thought, she is so amazing. Claire Poole, she's like my idol.
Come on. People don't want to hear this. They want to hear about you.
They do. So I'm the CEO of an organization called the Sports Environment Alliance. And how did I get here? I think that's the question you asked me. In this role and in this work. I think I do mention a few things about my upbringing because it does lend itself to the motivation of working in this space. But I was I am a child of Vietnamese refugees from Vietnam. And growing up in that way, in a humble way, I think, and also living as a city rat, we learned very early in life about need versus want. And I think that was something of a driving force behind the way I looked at the world, I guess. And at the same time, something that entered into my life quite early was sport. And so this is really a marriage of two really important things that changed my life or shaped my life in one space of work, which is sport and environment. But working in the industry, so working in sport industry in various roles. So I worked in sports medicine, I worked in sports psychology, I worked in sports business. It sounds like I'm probably 100 years old for all of the areas that I've worked. But in that space, I really saw a huge opportunity during that time for sport to do some really good things. And in firsthand working at the PGA Tour and their campaign around what's called the Drive to a Billion at that time was, working in every tournament site to give back to those areas of need. And I think that mentality of how powerful institutions like sport can do good was something that really aligned with things that I learned as a child. I had a godmother who her name was Sister Eustace Caggiano. She was known as the Mother Teresa of South Boston. And she always talked about, giving voice to the voiceless and giving or sharing power to the underprivileged. And she did that with us directly. But, that mentality, the things that I learned from her resonated in the work that I was doing in sports. And fast forward, in my role in academia here in Australia, there was the opportunity for sport to do more for all sorts of people in all sorts of ways, opened up my appetite to extend that opportunity to looking after our natural world. And I did say at the very beginning, I fangirled you for a long time, and you were part of that sort of journey of initiating the thoughts and the development of what's called the Sports Environment Alliance. Was co-founded in 2015 with myself and Malcolm Speed, who's a long-time administrator, and really a well-regarded one for all sorts of things, including women in sports as an issue. There was a woman who came up to me at Cricket Australia one day and is like, "Oh, Mal, do you remember when you interviewed me 11 years ago and you asked me about, the role of women in cricket? And now we're talking about women in cricket, and so on and so on." So he sort of crystal balls a lot of things because he's such an experienced administrator. The point here is that it took a lot of events. You were one of those events to get to this point where the two things that I love most have merged into this organization. And a lot of people have contributed to that and still do. And I just love it. I love working in the space. I love seeing how the organization has grown to where it is like right now.
Amazing.
So that's a medium version.
That was perfect. I'm going to ask you more about Sport Environment Alliance in a minute, so people can understand a little bit more about that. But as I expected you would, you skimmed over sort of being recognised as in the top 100 women of influence of the Australian Financial Review in 2019, and the fact you've contributed to 50 internationally peer-reviewed research papers, etc. I knew you'd skim over those accolades. But you are seriously clever and seriously driving change in this area. And I think that's really important for people who are listening to understand. So I'm going to make a note of that before we move on to Sport Environment Alliance. For those who aren't currently perhaps a member of a Sport and Sustainability Association, we know Sport Environment Alliance is focused obviously for Australia and New Zealand, and we have bases in the UK, we have Green Sports Alliance in the US, we have SANSI that works internationally. Thankfully, there's these brilliant member organisations available for people on their journey towards increasing climate action or increasing sustainability within their sports organisation. But talking about C specifically, as we'll refer to it, Sport Environment Alliance, what do you do for your members? Who are your members and how do you support them on this journey?
C, compared to the other organizations, we're quite small because, of course, the market here is smaller, but we're mighty, and we also align very much with the other organizations. But the work that we do, I think, comes from a philosophy that's motivated, and the foundation of it is all built in respect for the natural world. How do we build that respect? And we sort of talk about, not in a religious sense, but we talk about C as like a church of all sinners, and any organization can join so long as we're going towards the light, the renewable energy light, and all the ambitious targets related to. And I think that's probably a good way of summarizing who we are. And what we do is really about supporting those, I don't want to call them sinners anymore, but the members. We support the members. And the way that we do it is, if you talk about it in corporate speak or strategy speak, would be in the 3 pillars of knowledge, networks, and then the global movement. So, we share knowledge in so many different ways, whether that be through developing resources, which we have worked with, for example, recently the Victorian government, which is a state government here, to develop a set of resources that are free to use. And you can find them at noplanetnoplay.org. Mainly, kind of focused on addressing climate mitigation, adaptation at community level, but really any organization could follow the checklist step by step, and it be applied to them. And then there's events, that we host. And then in terms of networks, we're connecting them peer to peer so that they can lean on one another. Everyone's got a water challenge. Everyone's got some sort of energy challenge or materials challenge, and someone's got a solution. So there's no use to repeating that or recreating. And then the third is that global movement piece. The work that you do in Sport Positive is incredible. And a lot of our members look to other standards of practice in other markets, to glean insights on things that are happening cutting edge from an innovation, technology, ideas at different levels. And so connecting them to other organizations, other associations, other events, other conferences, news, and like-minded organizations, not necessarily in sport, outside of sport and in around it. So that's pretty much what C does.
And your members are federations, governing bodies, leagues, clubs, is it individuals or is it just organizations?
So constitutionally, we are member organizations. So all of them are organizations as members. Mm-hmm. We do have sort of friendly donors as individuals, but they're all organizations. The thing that makes, I think, C quite special, because as a member organization, we don't focus purely on just elite sport. We look at the whole of sport, the whole of community. So the local, we have a member called the Thornbury Turf Strokers Cricket Club, who's a member. And then we've got as big as our football, Australian Rules Football, Australian Football League as a member. So that's a national league. We do have federations like Tennis Australia, Cricket Australia, and then teams, and then venues and infrastructure. And another thing that's quite unique, I think, too, is having councils, because councils, we have, you will be here in Australia, Claire, at some point soon.
Yes.
And you will see that every council has green space galore. Well, any natural asset really for sports. So white, blue, and green. And that makes them a really integral part of that community of sport, because they, of course, own or manage those spaces. So they're really important. So the membership is quite diverse. And I don't think all associations are the same. I think there's a lot more focus on elite. But I think the thing that makes C very special is that we look after community and get them involved and ensure that there's no access, like barriers to access for community sport, because that's quite important. That, they're the heart and soul of every community. It's important that they're a part of it.
Definitely. And that the community side and the grassroots side is huge. I mean, the elite, and we're kind of guilty of that as well, because elite and professional sports, we work with so much more frequently, because, to be honest, it's slightly easier to manage, to communicate with. You're more likely to be someone leading that up, whereas at a grassroots or a community level, it's so volunteer led, and people haven't necessarily got the time to be able to come into these sorts of conversations. That isn't as much of the access, and that's something from our perspective at Sport Positive we want to do more at a county level, more grassroots, and supporting more grassroots efforts. And that's brilliant that C is already doing that, because we know, although at an elite level they've got a microphone to the world and there's a lot of massive opportunities to drive change, in a drive and change at a level where we compete, where we as just individuals in our communities compete. As you said, there's so much green space, isn't there? And there's so many football pitches and cricket pitches and rugby pitches that are being upkept by communities, and there's opportunities to make a lot of that green space. So it's brilliant that C's already doing that, and I think that's something we should all be thinking about more as well. When we talk about sustainability in sport, our mind naturally goes to professional and elite sport, but it's not the case. We have to start doing more community and grassroots as well, don't we?
Yeah, I love that. And I would love to hear from you, Claire, about that. Like, from your conversations with people in and around sport, is there a trend of the community getting a look? Have you seen that happening? Or
in the UK, I think there's more, because we have the likes of, I mean, it's not pure grassroots, but the likes of Birmingham County Football Association, etc., who have done amazing work with their initiatives, etc., around sustainability. But I think the biggest challenge, I think, for us being able to support grassroots and community is actually accessing them at a level where we can help, and also the time and the resource that's needed to sort of make sustainability changes. Like, I remember being told, I was having a conversation with a chap years ago about grassroots, the issues of tackling sustainability at a grassroots level. And he gave an example of, I think it was a cricket pitch somewhere in the UK, and he said, I'm a volunteer down there, and he said it's difficult when people, it's their social area and it's their reason for getting out of the house, to say to them, the cricket pitch doesn't really need to be mowed with a petrol lawnmower 3 times a week, because this there's a small, but there is a carbon footprint to that, in terms of it doesn't need to happen, and you are using petrol or diesel or fuel, a fossil fuel to do that. That was their reason to get out of the house, to go to their local community pitch and to support that and to do something. And there was the social, I think, with grassroots and community, whereas at an elite level, maybe we can look more at the sustainability pillars distinctly around environmental, social, financial governance. I think at a community and grassroots level, that it's mostly volunteer led and people are already giving so much of their time just to make the sport happen, to then ask them, can you also lead this initiative, and can you come up with this innovation, and can you help the community do this? It's more and more of an ask. And it's not to say it's impossible, obviously, but when we see from our positions in our organizations how difficult it can be at an elite level to drive some of this change, we realize how much more difficult it can be at a grassroots when we're relying entirely on volunteers and people giving their time to this stuff. So I think we're starting to see more of it, but I think there's more challenges for us to tackle to ensure this change happens substantially at grassroots. Although I think it's starting to change, and I think, to your point, councils, local governments, national governments, etc., have to support that change. We can't just continue to rely on the goodwill of people who care about the environment to give their time and their money to make these changes.
Yeah, I mean, totally. I mean, you're right about the, we've already got a really strong volunteer base at the community level, and they're giving so much. And that's where council does need to step up, especially if it requires infrastructure investment, or if it's about change in the way that it's maintained, like the grounds. I think the real opportunity is the fun part of sustainability at the grassroots level. Like I've seen so many, and I don't know where you want this conversation to go, but this is where it's going there.
We go where it takes us.
But it's been great to see some examples in community where they're having a lot of fun with changing their canteen practices, like moving away from single-use plastic, and instead, replacing it with, and of course, COVID's made it difficult, but, replacing it with just everyday mugs that people donate from the club, and they do a little drive. And this is a great example. I remember the comment was about, as to your point, this is where people have their social time, that it was like an extension of their living room, because everyone was standing around the football pitch with their, their mismatched mugs, having, tea while they were watching. And it felt like it was their living room, just as part of family. And I think that you could do things that are quite subtle and still participate in a positive way without it being too onerous. There's lots of things. I'd probably list 100, but yeah, I think community certainly needs to be part of that conversation, because there's so many more of those assets out there, with so many more communities and networks in those communities. And it's just like any other community group that cares about climate, right? I mean, there's will be those who are more activists on that side of it, but what's to say sport community clubs couldn't be part of that conversation and action? I think that they'd be really good.
And I'd love to see as well more. I think there is examples of this happening, but what we tend to see at a professional level, certainly with clubs, is that they usually have a really extensive social program, and maybe they've got a brilliant environment program, or maybe they're moving that forward. But they usually have a very substantial social program in terms of their local community work and supporting people, as we saw loads through COVID of, football clubs here in the UK ringing their fans who are elderly and their season ticket holders to check in if they're okay and just have a conversation, or sending food packages and different things like that. But again, I'd love to see more of the social environment intrinsically linked with professional sports clubs supporting community sports clubs, choosing community sport clubs in the same borough, the same council, the same area, and sort of thinking, well, we're doing these, we're going through all of these environmental hoops ourselves, and we are creating a much more sustainable club. How can we use these learnings and then drill them down into community clubs as well? And it's complex, I know. There's a lot of layers to that, and there's a lot of different amazing work happening in a lot of ways. But I think we're at a stage where as the professional, as sport and sustainability, as tackling climate change through sport continues to evolve and mature, I think we need to start thinking about how, rather than clubs, leagues, organizations just being incredible themselves, how those learnings can be drilled down into organizations in their local communities that maybe haven't got the resource they've had to make these changes, and trying to connect those a little bit more. And I'd love, if anyone's listening to this podcast and they've got great examples of that, I'd love to hear them, because these are the sorts of things I think we should be talking about more. And I'm sure it's happening, but I can't immediately go to an example, and we talk to sport all the time. So I'd love to hear more about that, because I think, again, these are just opportunities for us to talk about and normalize, and then sports organizations will start looking at that.
Claire, you need to start a program on that. I think it's really good. This sort of, because you're already looking at like youth, for example, but mentorship, mentorship in the broadest sense, but like also being a good neighbor, like those who have sugar and the other people don't have the sugar. You share the sugar, like there will be huge opportunities for, once the professional and elite sports get their act together and they feel confident and confident that they are secure in what they're doing and they're walking the talk authentically, then they can start being able to help other people. It's like, that metaphor with put your mask on and then help others. I think that's kind of the trajectory at the moment. So I'm looking forward to that. And I hope that all this work, that it'll come from this conversation that we're having, right?
We'll be able to track it back to here. I'm sure. Well, I hope I'm contacted by like 20 people who are already doing this work. And then we can talk about that in a future podcast.
It must be a segment at Sport Positive. Throw it in there.
On the community.
That'd be amazing. Big brother, big sister.
Love that.
So solved. Check.
Good
challenge.
Take it off. So I'm just thinking from, with that kind of in mind, and just thinking about your members who across, as you said, are across professional and sort of community level. What are you hearing as the biggest concerns around the climate crisis right now in Australia? Or has that evolved? Has it always, since you started, sort of been the same issues, or have you seen that change? But what are the concerns?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say something that kind of links what we were just talking to this question as well. We have faced a lot of climate related impact over the more recent years. So I think it's very topical for our communities. And one of the great examples of a big brother or big sister move here is with Cricket Australia, actually. We talked about this at Sport Positive, is when we had bushfires and there wasn't a consistent way of understanding what is safe in terms of air quality to play within for community cricket, all the way up to elite cricket, that they stepped in, did the research, set a policy, set standards and guides around what is considered safe as guidance. And that was such a great example of how an organization well-resourced could step up and do something right for their communities. Because of course you're a volunteer. Do you know anything about, parts per million or like air particulate matter? That's it's like totally left field, and for them to get some guidance in that space so that they can ensure that the kids who are playing or those who are vulnerable and those who are not, but are because it's climate, and it's climate change, like that people are protected and can play safely and happily and in a healthy environment. So I think that's a good example. But in terms of like, what are the immediate, challenges or issues that are being talked about, for a long time, it was quite silent, mainly because the environment that we're living in here politically and from a leadership point of view hasn't really been that strong. And I'm not saying that just my personal opinion. It is a fact, by all sorts of rankings. And as a result, it's really difficult because you do rely on signals that come from your own community, but as well government, from industry, that this is where we're heading, in terms of the economy and progress. What does that mean? And so sports here, it was quite silent. But recently, I think a lot of it has been around bushfire, and related to bushfire would be things like heat, extreme heat, or related to climate is extreme heat, and related to bushfires, biodiversity loss. I think that's the one that isn't being talked about as front and center, but is definitely the biggest concern that I personally have around climate change in Australia. Because one of the things that we talked about in the early days of Sports Environment Alliance forming was how special Australia and New Zealand is or are from a biodiversity point of view, and that's worth protecting. And I think it's just incredible to see how, just globally, and you would know this because I know you worked with IUCN, and it just how devastating those bushfires have been for Australia, and for the beautiful rare species that live and breathe in this part of the world. So I think those are the three. But I think from a sports point of view, they're not looking at necessarily from a planetary health point of view. They're mainly looking at it from a player and organization. So player health, safety, and organizational risk and reputation, more so than planetary health. I hope that, and I don't really care myself what they're motivated by, as long as action's being taken. I think eventually that connection will be so strong that they wouldn't be able to avoid understanding that is connected.
Yeah. And I think there's, again, with this, I think there's loads of naysayers about sport should be doing more, and some hypocrisy in sport, which we'll talk a little bit about shortly, just carrying on from the conversation I had with Lou in our last podcast about sponsors, etc. We'll get onto that shortly. But I think, again, as you mentioned, the work that sport's doing in Australia, as an example, under, I think I made a note from COP26 in Glasgow, which was obviously the climate summit in Glasgow in December last year, that the Australian government's policy response to the climate crisis was ranked last in an assessment of 60 countries released at the climate summit. So the reality is that the government in Australia, whatever they're saying in that sort of poll, is the policy response to the climate crisis is obviously not where it needs to be. So for then sport, as you said, we'd love sport to care more about the planetary health side, or, etc. But when you're working under a government that isn't actually showing that it cares about its nation, and that is the government that's running the country, it's a huge ask for sport to say we're doing this altruistically because we care, if there isn't that leadership above them. And as you said, the motivation, I think we can all be honest. And I think if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably in the sports industry and you're aware that sport is a business, and a lot of the motivations can be financial. Yes, there can be altruistic elements within there as well, of supporting the community and driving long-term sustainability, and supporting the broader issues. But generally, there's a financial element to it and a resource element to it. But as we've said, if the actions are driven because of that, and actually it does make good financial sense, everyone, to protect the environment and to make sure our sports, we have a planet in 200 years' time to be able to exist on and play sport on. That's where we're going to. But I think, that it's interesting in terms of the areas that you mentioned there about the concern. And I think the biodiversity loss is one where you have got something incredibly special in your part of the world, and we can see it in South America, etc., as well, in the Amazon and other areas where obviously biodiversity is incredibly important everywhere around the globe, but there are certain parts of the world where it is very unusual, very special, and a lot comes out of it, and Australia falls into that. So I think there's a lot to think about around the biodiversity piece. And then just to flag as well, actually, the role that sports played around the bushfires and the awareness of the bushfires and the impact of those globally, because they were happening during the Australian Open a couple of years ago in the Black Summer, I think it was called, wasn't it? Because of the issues there. So again, the role that sport can play to amplify some of these issues and raise awareness outside of just the sports community, but nationally and internationally.
Totally. I mean, I could sit here and not say a word, Cliff, because you say it all, and you say it all right. And, I saw, so two things I'd say. One is that I've seen, the diagram I usually refer to, where it shows how climate action, or action in general, can be the strongest, is when government, community, and industry work together. Yeah. And, it's obviously there'll be sometimes in history where industry is stronger than there's community and government, and vice versa across the way. In this instance, by fact, it seems to me community and industry must step up. And, we're seeing this is a huge opportunity. And that's why I would say I'm really incredibly proud of a lot of the sports who are taking a leadership position, the early adopters in particular, but those who have since as well, in an environment where it's not necessarily celebrated or elevated. And I think that's and or incentivized either, as you said, financially, or even the environment, regulatory environment, legislative environment that doesn't necessarily make it easy to do certain things, as simple as recycling as an example, or even purchasing the right kind of energy or having that in the marketplace. So I think that's where we're seeing what's happening, and where the opportunity is for sport to step up. And there's a real opportunity, because sport can be a very serious actor. I just saw the news just today with the Melbourne cricket ground being powered completely by 100% renewable energy. I think that's a huge, step in the right direction as like a leadership action. And the other point I wanted to say was about, the strength of other parts of that Venn diagram. So industry, you've probably been seeing in the news with Mike Cannon-Brookes, and just talking about him stepping up with AGL and trying to, and it's not a political conversation that we're having, but it's really just about leadership. It's about, making a good decision in an environment that's not encouraging or supportive, to accelerate that. And that's why, cities are stepping up here more so than any other industry. Hopefully will accelerate too. And sport can participate in that very, very actively. I think there's so many things I want to say about that, but but probably those are two big points there. That just echo what you already said.
But I think this conversation around government and sport is a really important one, and maybe one that we don't have as frequently. And I'm delighted we've touched on it, because again, I have so many conversations with people, and especially people who've been in sport and sustainability in Europe for a long time, even in a lot of cases in North America. When I put together the agenda for our summit, or for, we're talking about people, they're like, oh my God, Claire, how are you still talking about recycling? Or how are you still talking about, sustainability strategies? Like, come on, we've got to get past this. And I hear them loud and clear, but actually there's a lot of places around the world, and actually even states in the US, where recycling is not normal. Stadiums can't just separate and then put it into a municipal recycling program, because it doesn't exist. Places like the Balkans, they don't have recycling programs in place. So whilst to people who've been in this space for a long time, it feels very entry level, actually globally we're not there yet. And the governments, certain governments, in whether it's state or federal or national, there isn't always these protocols in place where really basic environmentally friendly behaviors can happen, let alone have the financial or political support to drive bigger changes, etc. So whilst I think we're both big advocates for the sport movement and the fact that it's not perfect, but actually no one is making sport organizations do this. It's all entirely voluntary, as with all industries, as with cities, as with business. I'm not saying sport deserves a medal, pun intended. Every sector and every organization's, they have a duty of care to do this, because they are creating a footprint in the environment. But I do think we have to bear in mind that actually in a lot of places there isn't government support for them to do that. It's not easier to do that. It's actually in a lot of cases more difficult to do that. So there's a lot around that.
I think that's like something that I respect about Sport Positive, is that you're making sure that, we talk a lot about social justice and environmental justice and transition. And, the journey does have markers for all sorts of people at different parts of the journey. And it requires that all of the support is still exists for those who are starting out. And I think that's, something that to justify how you have those conversations still, and it's still on your agenda, is that this is about equity and equitable progress. And you still need to have those starting point conversations for those who are starting out. So I think you keep doing it, girl.
Keep doing what we're doing. Keep doing what we're doing. So part of what I want to carry on talking about, and which we touched on in the last podcast with Lou Blaustein, where it was mentioned about, for example, Tennis Australia having the oil or the mining company Santos that was then dropped. It was a multi-year deal, and then after a year it was dropped because of pressure. We know Cricket Australia have got coal-fired power plants, energy sponsors, etc. And I think C was mentioned in that conversation by Lou as sort of saying, well, you know, an organisation like Cricket Australia is a member of Sport Environment Alliance, but things like this are still happening. And I think it's a valid point. And something that I think is great to get your input on, because it's worked out that we're chatting to you now in the following episode, but also that I'm not putting you on the spot, Sheila, because, you know, some of these organisations are signatories to the UN Sports for Climate Action Framework, and they have made external commitments to the environment, yet to people in the mainstream who are covering these pieces in the media, etc. Obviously, the two things don't go hand in hand, that their major sponsor is a fossil fuels company, but they are a member of the Sport Environment Alliance, or they are a signatory to the UN Sports for Climate Action Framework. So just because we're chatting to you and that was mentioned and C was sort of name-checked in that, I thought is a nice moment to sort of get your thoughts on that, on a complex issue, of your thoughts from a C perspective when you hear things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think let's highlight the word complex, because of course you said that just now. We talked about early on, you know, that this is about transition, isn't it? And a lot of these organizations and the industry as a whole, they're starting to learn, they're starting to become more enlightened, more aware of the connection between what they do and what the importance of protecting the natural world is, and where their opportunities might be to do the right things, to be a good leader, or to engage in serious climate mitigation and so on. So I think there's a period where we're going to see over time, and I don't know how long, but you'll see false starts, you'll see less desirable decisions, you know, and you'll see better decisions and so on as they transition and they're learning. It's like a little bit of artificial intelligence, you know, as they're like computing and making, as they learn more, they'll know more and they make better decisions. And I listened to your podcast, and I remember you saying, you know, the words of things like decisions made in silos. And that just triggered for me right away, you know, like there are decisions that are not aligning with some other parts of the organization who are committed to doing the right by planetary health. And that's just a sign of the growth in this area and the transition in this space. So, you know, we talk a lot about things like integrating into culture and the DNA of an organization, certain values. And, you know, in previous decades and previous lives of organizations, women didn't matter. Or, you know, the what we call called communities, culturally and linguistically diverse communities, didn't matter. You know, people who are in the LGBTQ. So that, you know, those issues, the social issues, including environment, because environment is a social issue, you know, it's going to require a whole of organization approach to integrating it into their DNA, into their psyche, and then expressed into decisions like sponsorships, like commercial deals, like who their friends are, who they employ, who their leaders are, who are their CEOs and board, and so on. So I am looking forward to seeing the industry grow into and mature into a more sophisticated and more integrated organization that does have planet in their lifeblood. And I'm not surprised that there are still decisions being made that way. No. So that would be my comment.
Yeah, and I think again, I don't want to labour, because Lou and I talked about it a little bit in the last episode, but I don't want to labour the point. But I think whilst we can't accept the status quo, we don't want to say it's fine. Oh, it's fine. You know, or sports organisations can do loads of operationally sustainable, positive, you know, work, but then still take all the finance from fossil, etc. Long term, it's not. We don't want that. We don't want it to happen. We don't want that to be the case. But as you said, in a period of transition, I remember when, you know, after, from our side in the UK, Blue Planet and David Attenborough and everyone really started the wave against single-use plastic. Exactly. I shook his hand. Everyone shook his hand.
I don't wait to shake your hand. The hand that shook his hand.
I never watched it again. No, I did. COVID, guys, COVID. So always hygiene. So, but no, I think that wave around single-use plastic that happened, and everyone became so aware of single-use plastic and how abhorrent it was and the impact it was having on our oceans and how horrendous it was. And I remember, now it still happens, but at the time where organizations were starting to move to more environmentally sustainable behavior, but they still had contracts with some single-use plastic providers. So we'd have paper straws in plastic cups, and people would be taking photos like, what kind of farce is this? Like I can't finish my drink because I've got a paper straw, but it's in a plastic cup. What are we even doing here? Transition isn't linear. It takes a while to change, and there's a time where people are going to be unhappy with that. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to look good necessarily. But to your point, as long as we do transition, okay, we can see it. If in 10 years' time we're having this same conversation where organizations are doing incredible sustainable work, but they are still taking money from fossil fuel companies or heavy carbon, then we've got a problem. But I think we are probably quite agreeably to the majority in the infancy of this movement. Even though we're getting further and further, it's not perfect yet. And we don't want to give people a pass. We don't want to give organizations a pass. And it's right that their feet be held to the fire. But we also have to realize that there is going to be a slightly sticky, uncomfortable period where there's going to be these opposing things happening.
Yeah. And that too, like I am on board, and I think Lou said this is unacceptable, and that will be the public outcry. This is unacceptable, and we must have that voice continue to say that louder and louder, because to move you need to agitate and catalyze, and that requires pressure and the role of C in this whole transition is about support. It's about advice. It's about compassion. It's about supporting them to see the wrongs of their ways, or whatever. But in a learning environment, and but as well, the world around us must change as well. Like we talked about the environment we have here in Australia. Luckily, New Zealand is much more, has a different environment. But what I would say is that if we don't have a model here where transition to a new paradigm is incentivized in the right way, financially in a big way, to then make better choices too, it will be difficult for a lot of organizations to make good decisions. And I'm not saying that they cannot make the good decisions, regardless, as there are organizations who are dropping partners and friends at a loss and in a way that will make them vulnerable. And shame for a lot of these organizations out there who, and I'm not going to name any, but are know full well that they're in a position where they can wave some cash and take advantage of the vulnerable. This is not a good way to act in the world. And I'm saying that as a person, as myself, I do not think that is respectful of anyone, and as equally, the natural world. But that's what's happening, and it's really sad to see that happening.
Yeah, but I think as well, just to not end on a sad note.
Oh, right.
But don't want to end on a sad note. But to your point as well, when we were talking about this, about the point you wanted to make around not always focusing on what sports organizations are doing badly, what they're actually, and I think that tends to be a media perception where we're trying to really encourage sports organizations to communicate and share this great work they're doing. And there's sometimes a lot of hesitancy because if they're not perfect, is the risk higher than the reward? And I think, again, it's the society we live in, social media and all the efforts around that. But your point is a really important one of like, why do we always have to focus on can we try and focus on some of the good stuff as well and not always look at the negatives? Let's try and look at some of the positive work that's happening and actually the changes that are being made.
Yeah. And I know it sounds a bit, I don't know, maybe this is an optimist to me, but I think it's really quite important that we use all of those opportunities as a learning experience and a shared learning experience. I wish we could be very honest about what's happening and what's happening within your organization. And I think it makes you quite vulnerable. I say vulnerable, I've said it a few times, but like, being vulnerable is a beautiful thing, and it allows us all to benefit from your learnings and your experience as an organization. And I think that if we're more transparent about things that are happening for us, then everyone can be more empathetic about what's happening. And as well, I don't want it to be like, oh, poor sport, but at the same time, I think it's about how do we gain energy from the positive parts of those experiences to propel everyone to move forward in the right way together. And there's probably a lot more layers to this that we don't have time for, but it's all that social justice, all that the equity piece, the transition, the kind of focusing on all the ways that we can move forward versus naming and shaming. I find that to me and to see really the organization, we don't operate in that space of naming and shaming, although that is a part of the system that's required. There's pressure and so on. But if we can put more energy into that, I think that actually does propel. Naming and shaming has a kind of has an effect that's a bit short-lived, I would say. I think a lot more of the benefit of long-term benefit, positive benefit, it comes from the compassion, the kind of counseling, the support of moving forward.
Yeah. And also, Janet, as you said, part of it for us is trying to understand and share why decisions are made. Why, why has this happened? Why was that, Lou's point last week was like, there's other money available, which I'm sure there is, in terms of how decisions are made, etc. But sometimes, again, from the outside, professional sports organisations can look like behemoths, but behind the scenes, there's actually quite a small staff working there, and they're all doing a lot of different things and wearing a lot of different hats. And again, I think from an industry perspective, understanding and trying to share some of that in a way that sports organisations still feel comfortable with, but in a way that isn't sort of explaining things away and saying it's not our fault, not taking a defensive approach, but a humble approach of this is where we are. These are decisions that have been made historically that perhaps we still have to live with, or, these decisions that were made not through the environmental lens. These are the ways we've changed our approach to ensure this doesn't happen again, or we decided to take on this sponsor because of this.
And you said this in the last episode, Lou, is change the narrative, have a purpose for decisions. And I think that's a really interesting topic, and you definitely I would love to hear that on your podcast, because it's
we must
really
get a few different people to talk on that maybe. So just to finish up, it's been so fascinating. I'm delighted we've covered so much stuff, and I love the fact we've spoken about community as well and started bringing that through, which is awesome, and to hear more about Sport Environment Alliance and you and the work that's going on. So just to finish up with, I want to ask you, what, is either something that you wish you'd known when you started this work in 2015 and you set up Sport Environment Alliance? If you could go back then, knowing what you know now, what would you have wanted to know?
So one of the things for those who are working or wanting to work in this space more, I think it's really there's a lot out there, and you can find all about it through Claire's podcast, but as well in lots of other venues. But there's just avenues. There's a lot of stuff happening, which is amazing. And I think start from there, and I think the other thing is to wherever you are, find the way to tell the story for the natural world. We often talk about or refer to the Lorax by Dr. Seuss, be a voice for the trees. And I, if you have that in the back of your mind of how do you tell the story of the natural world in a way that's compelling, I think that will really help the cause, instead of purely kind of tromping around and pushing buttons. I think the best way is, as talked about before, respect and compassion. I think that will help you move the needle wherever you are.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Sheila, it's been a pleasure to have you in here. Thanks for listening to the Climate of Sport podcast. Please like and subscribe and get in touch if you want to share information about the work that you're doing, if you want to appear as a guest or you want to recommend guests, or you just have ideas of conversations you'd like us to have. You can get in touch by emailing info@sportpositivesummit.com.